I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at parallel distortion, a classic production music technique. But what we're going to do isn't to take an already busy production and add some extra distortion to it. What we're actually going to do is to build a distortion solution, which is actually a kind of active component of the track. Whenever we think about building productions, we tend to think more instruments, another thing to record, but sometimes our effects can almost become like instruments in their own right, and we're going to see how that's done in this video. Let's just listen to the two elements that make up this track as it stands right now. Okay, so I've got this beat loop and I've got this little sort of synth part that's happening on top, which you can see has come from this loop from Apple Loops called dub chord layers. And the only thing that I've done so far is I've added a noise gate to both sounds so that effectively both of them are kind of shutting down when their levels drop below a certain threshold. And that's giving this slightly spiky quality to the sounds, which I really like. And what I want to do is to see if I can configure a sort of solution from a distortion point of view, which then becomes kind of playable, almost as if I can sort of play with it as the track unfolds to introduce it, have its tone change in some way, and in some way kind of provide us with sort of extra boost and power through the mix. So what I'm going to start by doing is selecting both of these channels, and I'm going to send them through to an auxiliary bus, and on that bus I'm going to just turn up the sends to both of them, which I can do simply by clicking option and then clicking on the actual send level, so they both go up to unity gain. And what I'm then going to do on this auxiliary is to set up the clip distortion plugin. Now I'm going to find that in here in the distortion folder. Now any of these distortions have the potential to kind of provide us with distortion, and I'm going to use this particular plugin. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going parameter by parameter to explain what we're doing here. It should be pretty intuitive, beginning to see exactly what happens about the tone changes to the sound as we begin to manipulate some of these parameters. Now, one of the advantages of working with auxiliaries in this way is that I can solo this effect. And because the levels coming into the effect are obviously being generated by the beat loop and by the synth, obviously by soloing it, we're just going to be hearing what the distortion is bringing in terms of a sound. And because it's on an auxiliary, the first thing I can do is to take the mix dial up to 100%, which means that this plugin is now only providing distortion. I don't need it to provide the dry signal. When I come out of solo mode, we'll hear the dry sounds feeding it. So let's just hear how this distortion sounds with these default settings. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is to drive some extra gain into the plugin, both using the input gain dial, which is like dry gain, if you like, or sort of a sort of pre-amplification sort of level, if you like, and that's feeding this drive circuit, which is where we're beginning to introduce actual distortion, color change to the actual signal itself. What I'm then doing is using these two tone change controls to effectively set the kind of frequency areas around which I want to sort of target my distortion. I want something which isn't really toppy and bright, but certainly isn't overloading the bottom end either. And then let's just have an experimentation with a little bit of the kind of high shelving and low pass filter options over here on the right as well. Okay, so as a start, I'm going to go with this collection of parameters. So I'm not absolutely decimating the signal by driving it really, really hard, which I could do if I wanted to with extra gain and extra drive. But what I have got is this slightly more sort of tough, more robust sound. Now, again, what we're going to start by doing is introducing this signal. I'm just going to label this as distortion, so I know what it is, this auxiliary bus. Let's have a listen to the mix again, and after 4 bars, I'll punch in the distortion. Okay, so it's making a big difference. But what I'm just starting to lose a little bit is this kind of clipped quality that I've got as a result of using the noise gates on the dry sounds. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try and introduce a bit more of that back into this distortion treatment as well. I'm going to solo the distortion again, and I'm going to copy the gate settings from one of these instruments. This is the beat loop, and I'm going to put it in the second slot underneath the clip distortion. That's a quick way of me being able to just literally get a gate into this channel as well, but I am obviously going to need to open this and configure its threshold point in particular so that it meets the sort of specific output of the distortion channel itself. In fact, clearly, I'm playing the track back at the moment, but obviously the threshold point is too high, and as a result, the gate is basically just closed. Let's just drop it down. And you can see now that toggle between sort of open and closed. And as a result, now we've got that same sort of spikiness. Again, let's just put that back into the mix. I really like that moment before beat 3 each time where we get this kind of gap in the mix overall. Works really nicely. Okay, so we've still got this treatment which is working nicely and it's giving us this extra quality, but it's not really an active element of the track. It's not really sort of doing anything other than simply providing distortion and kind of filling in some of that, the gaps and providing some extra color. What do I mean in terms of actually make it an active track element? Well, of course, the first thing I could do is to start thinking about it from a volume perspective. So I could decide either that I'm going to introduce this from the beginning and then drop it out at some point, or alternatively, I might simply decide that I want to sort of automate its level so that its volume comes in. Okay, so that's not particularly spectacular, but it's beginning to introduce this idea that we can be sort of dynamic or fluid with the way that this sound might perform within the track, that it's something that we can bring in and out, introduce in exactly the same way that we would with any other instrument. But of course, we can go further with that idea. Let's introduce the idea of a filter after this effect. I'm going to come down to Logic's filters, which are here, and come and find the auto filter. Again, I'm going to just solo this sound for a moment. And what I'm interested to experiment with is the band pass filter, which is going to cut out low frequencies and high frequencies and sort of center its activity around the middle of the cutoff dial. And again, obviously, as I play with this, the sound will become more dynamic. Now, if I wanted to, I could actually emulate exactly that movement, the movements that I was just making a moment ago with the cutoff frequency sort of rising and falling by using an LFO. If I wanted to, I could introduce the LFO, which is here. I could set a rate. In fact, by default, it's set at 1 bar. And instantly now, what we're going to find is that this shape, this waveform shape, which I can see here, via this dial here, is going to start introducing movement into the cutoff frequency. Let's make that 2 bars. And we don't need very much LFO movement in order to begin to hear enough of a change for that sound to be rising and falling sort of across the active frequency areas of this filter. But what I could also do would be to experiment with the idea of introducing some envelope, which means that this shape here will again sort of attach itself to the sort of performance of the filter. In other words, as the sound is introduced, we'll get this nice sort of little spike, and effectively this envelope will sort of play out every time the volume breaches the threshold amount. In other words, if the signal gets loud enough, we'll begin to hear some envelope style shaping of the distortion treatment. That's good, it's sort of hyped it up a little bit. It feels a little bit quiet to me. What we can actually do is to boost the post filter amount, so we're effectively adding a little bit more volume. I've also got a main output control here, so if I need the signal to be louder, it can be from that perspective as well. But of course, having set up some envelope shaping, I can still bring automation to the mix as well. What I'm actually going to do is to just double the length of the track overall by simply just copying this over here. And what we're going to start doing is experimenting with a couple of different parameters that we've looked at already. In a minute, I'm going to go back and think about creating some sort of volume shape changes. But what I'm going to do for now is just to begin to think about shaping the overall tone of the sound by making some of these filter changes in real time. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of the track, instantiate latch mode so that any changes that I make are going to be written and made part of the piece. And the moment I do that, obviously the distortion channel is added to my project. I'm going to come out of solo mode so that I can actually hear this under the other elements of the track. And we'll just begin to experiment with the tone of this parallel distortion treatment. Okay, so I sort of discovered halfway through that these lower frequency areas around low cutoff values was kind of where I was most enjoying the filter. So having pressed stop and gone back into read mode, I can obviously just press A to come into the automation lane. I can then come down to the bottom of the used parameters where I'll find the cutoff point. And of course, at this point, it'd be very easy for me just to zoom in and just go and find this kind of area. And maybe we'll start all the way down here, kind of towards the bottom by rubbing out the earlier values and just begin to have this kind of slow ramp before the sound gets a little bit more dynamic towards the back end. And any points that I want to get rid of, I can just literally just sort of draw a box over, and then maybe what we could do would be to have this return so that I can sort of re-loop it back to the same value that I've got right at the beginning. And obviously I can keep manipulating these points until I'm happy with them. And then what we could also do would just to jump back to one other thing that we tried, which was to introduce volume. Again, maybe what we do is we delay the start of exactly how this effect comes in. Maybe what I might do, in fact, is actually have a ramp all the way from the beginning, which just slowly introduces this effect to around the sort of halfway point so that the parallel distortion treatment sort of creeps in, not only in terms of its tone, but also in terms of its volume. Okay, so in this video, what we've done is to start looking at parallel distortion. Why parallel? Well, because it sits alongside the dry sounds. It's like parallel compression in that regard. It's an additional treatment which sits alongside the dry sounds and works in parallel with those in order to produce a particular effect. And parallel distortion is incredibly useful for a whole number of things. And also not just in an EDM context. Hopefully you're already thinking about ways that you might apply this to music that you might make. This idea of just a little bit of extra aggression coming from a sort of an active channel in this way. But what we've done isn't just to set up a parallel distortion treatment that just sort of sits there minding its own business. We've turned it into an active track element by thinking about parameters that make this effect dynamic, whether that's volume bringing in and out the effect, whether it's the idea of sort of tone change using filtering so that the contours of the sound come and go a little bit. And of course we could go way further than this. I could begin to maybe add a tremolo so that the effect moves from side to side. I could think about introducing a little reverb effect in there somewhere, or maybe what I could do would be to modify modify the gate parameters so that from this super clipped, really sort of staccato, punchy effect that we've got right now, by dropping away the threshold point, more of the signal would come through and that distortion would stick around for longer and not sort of disappear quite as aggressively as it does right now. And again, that's just something I could automate if I wanted it to come and go within the track. In fact, maybe I could build a whole track out of just this distortion treatment. These elements just stay exactly the same way the whole way through, and the only thing that's changing as the track plays back is the way that I experiment with distortion around it. It's quite an interesting way of thinking about production.